Okay, hey everyone. Glad to have you tuned into this video. Wanted to talk to you today about how to fill out a purchase contract. We're going to use the Cincinnati purchase contract, Cincinnati Dayton purchase contract as an example, but we realize we're in about 18 different MLSs right now. There might be some different details about how you do it in your market if you're not in the Cincinnati or Dayton markets. But I still feel like this will be important in the big picture for filling out a purchase contract, okay? So to do this, I wanted to have the very best agent in the United States teach us how to do a purchase contract. He was not available, so we're gonna have Marcy do it instead. So, actually, Marcy—
beat me to it.
Right. Marcy Gantt is here. She's going to show us how she does a purchase contract. She has been around the block. She is a great agent, one of our top producers. Very excited that we can partner with Marcy, and very excited that she's actually willing to impart some of her knowledge, skills, and wisdom to us through this. So without any further ado, the crowd goes wild. And go ahead, Marcy, tell us, how do you fill out a purchase contract?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for the invite to help with this education piece, especially with the new contract rolling out. So I figure we'll just jump right into it. I'll go ahead and share my screen. It's, as I've nicknamed it, it's now 11 pages of joy. So we've got some legwork to do, so we might as well jump right in. Let me click this.
Nice that they updated the purchase contract so that it's even more complicated now.
Right, impossibly more complicated. So
possibly,
impossibly
maybe better.
Awesome. So we've had a few updates, a few changes. A lot of it is still pretty, I would say, commonsensical, for lack of a better word. So you start on the first page, basically indicating what property you're asking to purchase, the property description, and I'm going to annotate just because I can. Property description, obviously address, city, township, zip code, county. Also super important to put in this parcel information. Number one, it helps to further identify the property in case, goodness forbid, there's a typo or something like that in the address. Everybody's on the same page with what's being purchased. The other piece is each and every parcel, because there may be more than one parcel actually being sold with this property. We can't always depend on title to catch that for us, even though a good title company usually will. But it's really important that as the buyer's agent, you're making sure you're transferring all of the right parcels. Or the other way, if you don't want all of the parcels, it's very important to list the parcels that you are offering to purchase. So don't be lazy. Make sure you put the parcel information in here too. The next section goes into our timelines. This is some updated information or updated phrasing, I would say. Time is of the essence with regard to any and all timelines. Basically means stick to these. We mean business. Don't take timelines loosely. Some agents are a bit more lax than others. I would never assume that you're working with a lax agent, because that's a really bad way to find out that you've lost the contract for your buyers, or at risk of losing it based on you missing a timeline. So this is a short paragraph, but super, super important. And make sure that your clients understand that. I'm huge on educating not only other agents, but also my clients, because they're sometimes the biggest obstacle for you with regard to a successful sale. Unfortunately, you have this contract. Okay, now you have to do things that I can't do for you. You have to apply for financing. You have to make sure that, we get this inspection scheduled. You have to make sure you're providing the lender with all that they need. You have to transfer utilities. They've got some legwork. And so I'm very, very clear with my clients. I will, I jokingly say, I'll ride you like Seabiscuit to get this done, because this is too important not to. And I do use humor, but I'm also beating them with a velvet hammer sometimes. So It's a short little sentence right there, but it's number 2 for a reason, is what I explained to my clients. Next section, pricing and terms, common sense. Buyer hereby agrees to pay blank. What's your price? What are you offering? Purchase price is basically what we call that. Secondary to that, we go into the section about earnest money. Now, this has expanded quite a bit for you agents who are used to the other contract. You'll notice this got a lot longer and a little bit more detailed. So earnest money, for those of you who are new and aren't real familiar, or there are even some areas that really it's not as common as others, earnest money basically is your buyer's skin in the game for the process. Outside of inspection funds and appraisal funds, this is basically them showing your sellers how earnestly they want to purchase. This is them saying, we really, really want to buy your house. Here's how much money we're willing to leave on the table if we breach this contract. Once a seller signs this contract, they are legally obligated to sell your clients the property as long as you're performing. Once a buyer signs this contract, they cannot be forced to buy a house. They have multiple contingencies. However, if the day before closing, they just have a change of heart, the only recourse a lot of the time that a seller has is earnest money. But you will also note that in here, in the event, buyer and seller acknowledge that loss of earnest money may not be a party's sole remedy for failure to perform. So also make sure your buyers know, not only could you be out your earnest money if you breach this contract, the seller could take it a step further if they've made repairs or if they feel there are damages that they're due. But back to the earnest money itself, earnest money in the amount of blank, whatever funds you feel and your buyer feels are comfortable putting into a third-party deposit account to be held until closing. Depending on the purchase price, there's a little variability here. Anything between 1 and maybe 200, I'll do at least 1,000. Once you start getting into higher price points, it's time to start playing with a bigger bat. You need to really show your buyer's financial strength. That sometimes can be the winning piece when it comes to multiple offers. So if I'm bidding on a $600,000 house, I'm probably going to recommend at least $5,000 in earnest money. That's my opinion. Everyone has their own choice. However, I've seen that be a successful negotiation tool when proving how financially stable my clients are. Once you have that amount in there, this is one of the timelines on the purchase contract that goes into that time is of the essence box. You're committing to providing that to whomever the depositor is within so many calendar days of the contract. Now, the contract acceptance date is when all the signatures are on this contract, we're good. The date after, usually, and it says it very specifically in here, beginning the day following the contract acceptance date. So if you sign at noon today, your contract acceptance date is today, but your timelines begin tomorrow. That doesn't mean you can't get to work on these timelines today. If I have a contract executed, I'm sending my buyer wire instructions for earnest money. I'm sending them everything they need. There's no sense in wasting time. So I normally will provide the advice that my clients should deposit their earnest money with whatever title company we are using. Number one, it makes life easier. Number two, that title company will hold that in their non-interest bearing escrow account, and it's already there for that client to have listed on their settlement statement. Some clients like to use the other brokerage. Our brokerage does accept earnest money, but quite frankly, I just prefer title. That's a preference, but it makes my life easier and it keeps everybody out of that pot. Title is kind of our third party that works for the lender. That way, if there's ever a dispute, I don't have money with another broker.
One of the things I'll throw in there is if we, it helps to transfer the cost of the accounting to the title company or the other brokerage if we don't hold it. So, and that's one of the things that helps us to keep our fees for our agents lower, is if we transfer out those accounting fees to our competitors or to the title company. And the other thing is there's a bit of liability when you are holding the earnest money, and it has to do with clients who don't know what they're doing. They don't understand earnest money. And if a brokerage is required to hold it for 2 years, if there's a dispute, a lot of times the clients don't understand that. And they'll get on social media and say, Plumtree Realty is the worst. You know, they didn't give us back our earnest money. It's
Yeah.
like, well, it's the law.
But I
And
can't.
so anyways, if the title company, let them harass the title company, don't let them harass us. That's one of the reasons, just the liability and the stigma of it. So just a little footnote there.
Good point. And that wasn't even something I'd considered in the past, but it does make sense as far as that, you know, bad publicity is bad publicity, and especially ignorance leading to that is really frustrating because it's impossible to undo. In relation to that with earnest money, it's really important that you educate your clients that this is money they could possibly not have if they breach the contract, or if there's a dispute, like you said about earnest money. You touched on the 2-year period. Once that earnest money is secured, it does fall under several specific guidelines where both seller and buyer need to agree on the disbursement. And if there's no agreement, it is held by title or the brokerage for 2 years and then dispersed back to the buyer. So, but make sure that they understand that this is not guaranteed money that they're going to get back, or could get back easily if they breach. Now, again, there are contingencies in the contract, and buyers are very protected in a lot of those pieces, but we are dealing with humans on both sides of the aisle, so sometimes it gets a little muddy. A new addition that you'll see here as well is this sentence: this contract terminates for any reason, the earnest money will not be automatically dispersed to any party. And this may be a Chris question, because I have seen multiple, and I myself have done this, if we'll add it into the other addenda section that describes if the contract terminates based on inspection, earnest money is automatically returned to the buyer with no further signature required by the seller, just as some insulation to protect that. Chris, if we have this section here, but then in the other addenda, we simply write that same phrase, how does that work?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And what I would do personally, I would, if I'm representing the buyer, this protects the seller. Okay. So if I'm on the listing side and we receive a contract, this is great. Want that in there. If I'm representing a buyer, I've seen so many situations where a seller just gets ticked off and they're like, I don't care what the contract says, I'm not signing the release. Okay, well, that's just wrong. It's not nice. So I would, if I were representing a buyer, I would draw a line through this and I would have them initial it. And then I would write in the additional terms and conditions or on an addendum that if the inspections are terminated, or if the contract is terminated as a result of the inspections, that the earnest money will be returned to the buyer within 3 days. Yeah. So that's what I would do. You had how did you word yours, Marcy? That was really good too.
I normally will write, you know, if contract terminates based upon inspection findings, earnest money will automatically be returned to buyer with no further signature required by seller.
That's a great way to word that. I like that. Yeah. So I would draw a line through this and then include that verbiage later in the contract. Yeah. That's the way I would do it. So.
Okay. Anyway. And to your point, Chris, of course, yeah, with a contract of purchase, I normally take the stance that I'm the buyer's agent and I want to advocate for my buyer. So I hate that phrase. But as a listing agent receiving this offer, as you stated, I like that phrase. It just depends. Again, we've got humans on both sides. We want to protect our clients, and that may be a point of contention you just kind of have to work through. So figuring out the final piece to this. So you're welcome to have that earnest money held by whomever. I strongly recommend title for all the reasons Chris mentioned, and just for ease of use. If we're going to be wiring funds, it's best to just have them wiring to one specific company, the entire deal, less confusion. Trust me, keep it simple. The other piece that you'll notice here too, it does ask to, this is new, if it's with a title company, they are specifying that there could be separate escrow terms attached. You may want to discuss that with whatever your preferred title company is. I've never seen those, but that may be something that coming with this new contract, title companies start to generate to take some liability off of themselves, would be my expectation. Or, as Chris said, to make sure everybody understands what earnest money is and does, and the obligations of the escrow agent, the title company, when there is a dispute. I think that we'll probably start to see more and more of that to make sure that everybody's on the same page going forward. So earnest money, super important. Again, it may be specific to area. I would always recommend it just to show some financial strength for your buyer. This does talk about the dispute here. So the next section, the balance, basically the earnest money goes toward your buyer's settlement statement as a credit, as long as there's, obviously, if we get to the closing table. And I explained that to them as such. This will come as a direct credit to you at closing. It's basically a prepayment of some closing costs. Make sure they can pull it out of their bank account without repercussions as far as lending. You may want to touch base with their lender if they're really tight on some of their margins. But basically the next section just talks about the balance of the purchase price, how it will be paid, and where that's going to go to the title company at the date of closing. So settlement charges are charges that go toward part of the transaction of real estate. It's not the purchase price. It basically is all of your title fees. It's all of your lender fees. Some of your prepaids or impounds are words that we'll hear. I hate the word impound. It's an odd word to use on this. But basically it states it's all of the funds that a buyer needs to come to the table with, separate and apart from their purchase price and their down payment. That is something that sometimes buyers are surprised by. It would be a great idea to give them an estimate of that when you are under contract or prior to, so that they have an idea and they're very aware there will be additional costs. This section allows for you to request that a seller contribute to those in an amount not to exceed blank. So these are seller paid closing costs or settlement charges. This is something that will make your offer a little weaker if you're in a multiple offer situation, but you can also absorb those into a purchase price. So $100,000 with 5,000 seller paid closing costs really is a $95,000 offer. So a $95,000 offer with 0 seller paid close and $100,000 with 5,000 seller paid close are really 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And every good listing agent can do that math real good. So if your clients need additional help with closing costs and you want to really present a strong offer, I would strongly advise that you absorb those into the purchase price. If they absolutely say, nope, we're good to go, and you want to submit a really strong offer, I might recommend not putting any in there. That's a conversation for you and your client. Any questions or thoughts on settlement charges?
That's a great point, Marcy. And one of the things that I have done, depends on the situation, but if I'm going to make a $100,000 offer and I know we need 5,000 in closing costs, a lot of times I'll start out negotiating the price and I won't mention the closing costs, and we'll get through and get them to agree on the price. And then at the last minute, I'll say, would it be okay if we bump the price to 105 and then you pay 5,000 towards closing costs, after we know that they'll go with the 100? Mm-hmm. And sometimes I've used that approach to get it passed. So,
yeah. And that's a great
right scenario. If you're in multiple offers, I don't know, you might want to be careful.
Yeah. And that comes back to communicating and building that rapport with your listing agent. keeping them in the loop. If your client absolutely needs closing costs, I would not say those words to the listing agent if you're in a multiple offer.
Yeah.
Because then they start to feel like the wheels might wobble on financing, and that's not a warm and cozy feeling to instill with the seller.
Yeah.
But I like that approach, Chris. Kind of get their bottom dollar, get what they want, and then adjust it after. Doesn't hurt anybody. And there are some caps with regard to which type of financing they're using. So be sure that you understand what those are. FHA, it's up to 6%.
Mm-hmm.
And then conventional, it's up to 3% of the purchase price. Yeah, that's right. So there can be some substantial help given to your buyers as far as closing costs if your sellers are on board. That is not a let's do a cashier's check at closing type of thing. This is above board, so keep it that way.
Yeah.
Next section, the financing contingency. This basically, if your client is purchasing via cash, super simple. Most of us are using financing, so it's important to outline those details for the seller, not only to present an accurate offer, but also to present how strong your buyers are as far as the finance piece, if that's a negotiation tactic that you need. This indicates whether the buyer is going to use it for owner occupied, rental, or other. And then it's really important, and I didn't stress this at the beginning, there are boxes on the contract for a reason. There are boxes and blanks. So if it doesn't apply to your client, I would strongly advise, if it's a blank especially, to put in an NA. I've had attorney clients who just can't stand that we receive offers with blanks because there's a lot of potential for fraud. We love to assume everyone's like us, but let's be real. So if you put NA into a blank, you've at least inserted something so that if it does change down the road, it was one thing, but by having a blank on the contract, start to sweat a little bit. So if you come down here, so if it's cash, obviously fill out those pieces. If it's conventional or US, a new addition also is they have added USDA as a loan type, which is awesome because it really is a thing. US Department of Agriculture. So you need to select the proper loan type. You also need to go through and complete the rest of the information. And here's why. What you'll notice is there's no place on this contract that tells how much money my clients are putting down in those words. But if I've got a 20% down buyer versus a 10% down buyer, as a listing agent, that's a strength factor that I feel is important. So when you complete this, how you convey that to your seller is conventional loan, fixed or adjustable, in an amount not to exceed blank of the purchase price. That's where I'm showing off my financial strength of my buyer. So if it's 80% of the purchase price, everybody do the math, 20% down. If it's 90% of the purchase price, 10% down. Make sure you're giving this information to the seller. Yes, you've got a pre-approval, but not every letter is created equal. It may not specifically state it. So here's your time to wave that flag and say, hey, I'm a 20% conventional buyer. Woohoo. At an interest rate at prevailing rates and terms, and for a term of not more than blank years. Does the seller care if you're doing a 20, 30, 40-year loan? No. Fill in the blank. Come on. Same thing for FHA, USDA, VA. Complete all of the sections to give as much information to that seller. If the situation changes and your buyer goes from a 20% down to a 15% down, it's probably not going to be a deal breaker for that seller. But at least they were given proper information to start. So don't worry too much if it's, oh, we may do 15, we may do 20. Put the shiny one on the contract. As long as we close the deal, most people don't care. The other funding source basically is I've seen, like, not necessarily a trust account. It just kind of depends. You don't see this a whole lot. If you're getting into these types of pieces, hard money lenders and such, be mindful that you're aware of all of the stipulations that go into those, and make sure that your buyer is educated as far as what those parameters might need to be. This is very uncommon in my practice, but it may be more common in others. The next section talks about the financing time frame. This goes back to time is of the essence. This goes back to keeping your buyers on task to make sure we hit that closing date. This is a very specific statement. Seller's sole discretion by written notice terminate this contract so long as written notice of termination is delivered to the buyer prior to receipt of such written confirmation. This is not a, hey, just a reminder, we didn't get your financing information. This is an opportunity if a seller has a backup in the wings for them to get out of this contract scot-free. So your job as the buyer's agent is to protect your buyers, not only from others, but from themselves and ruining a good thing. It took a lot of work to get here. Make sure you keep it under contract. So this section outlines your timelines as far as the finance piece. So if you're financing conventional FHA, USDA, VA, these would apply to you. Obviously, cash does not fall under this. So qualification letter, pre-approval is much better. You can indicate whether it is or is not contingent upon the closing of buyer's other real estate. If they have to sell a house to buy a house, you really must disclose that. And whether it's attached or shall be provided, always attach it. Always attach it. There are agents who will not entertain any offer without a pre-approval. I can't say that I blame them, simply because if you're writing a check, you should probably be able to cash it and tell me you can't. So don't waste anybody's time and promise a pre-approval letter. It's not a solid offer without it. So then it goes into, so that's our first timeline. We've got it, it's attached. We're not going to give this calendar date any attention. Buyer shall complete a loan application, which shall include providing selected lender with intent to proceed, including payment for appraisal if necessary within blank calendar days. So here's another timeline. I would put close to 7. 7's good. That gives them plenty of time to get through W-2s, proof of income, bank statements, all of those items, and provide it to the lender. You will find most lenders do not, well, that's a terrible box. Most lenders do not do the intent proceed. It's usually in the big fat packet of lender docs that they have clients sign. Most other agents will not actually request it. A lot of the time it's missed. I would make sure that you start getting that from your lenders, or at the very least, some type of verification they've completed all those steps so that you can provide that to a listing agent and make sure you're adhering to this timeline. So then that's the second step. The next step is the conditional approval. So the lender is going to get to work. They're going to get their ducks in a row, and then they're going to provide a conditional loan approval within X amount of days. Talk to your loan officer for that. VA sometimes can take a little longer, so I might do 35 calendar days. Conventional, maybe 30. I'd keep it nice and long. I wouldn't overpromise and underdeliver, since that's a timeline, but talk to your loan officer. If they say we're closing in 21 days, I might still probably put 25. I get real nervous. And again, keep your clients on task, keep your loan officers on task. And then the clear to close is the woohoo moment, the CTC everybody's waiting for, within blank calendar days prior to the date of closing. That's a new one that they've added on there. I would probably put 3, since if the clear to close comes out with that CD, sometimes we need at least 3 days for that. Not sometimes, we always need 3 days for that. That one I would probably do 3 just to be safe. But historically, you've gotten clear to close 20 minutes before closing or an hour before closing. Chris is laughing because it's so true. When you're at that stage of the game, any seller who holds you to that and tries to, it's going to be a tough one to enforce. I mean, you are in the final section of that deal. You're doing the best you can. You could even put 1 calendar day. That one might be a little bit more variable. Talk to your lender. It depends. I know, Brandon with Plumtree he's getting clear to closes a week ahead of time, but again, don't overpromise and underdeliver on these timelines. It can get a little squirrely. Thoughts, questions on that one, Chris? That's kind of a lot, but
our recommended lender is
Oh yeah.
Plum Tree Home Mortgage.
Shameless plug.
Right. If you use our mortgage company, it helps us stay in business and keep our broker fees lower. So we have never raised our broker fees in the 10 years that we've been in business. And so it helps us when you use our vendors. So
It's awesome. And not even because of the affiliation or anything. It's great service, very informative. They have this really useful tracker system that's pretty fancy. So it's nice to have somebody in your corner. It really is.
They are fast. They are really fast.
Yeah.
And when do you need a pre-approval? On the weekends.
Right.
And our loan officers will get those to you on the weekends. And so I've contacted other loan officers before. They'll say, "Oh yeah, Monday morning, give me a call." I'm like, we're looking at houses today.
Right.
They're not going to wait till Monday. So.
Right. It'll be gone on Monday. Sorry.
Yeah.
And it's really important also, kind of as a segue, I connect my buyers with financing as soon as possible at the beginning of our relationship, because it's so important that they're educated on that piece too. Not only with settlement charges, down payment, options, you've got mortgage insurance, you've got all of these little moving parts that really are explained much better by someone smarter than me about mortgage. And that way I've had conversations with that loan officer already. If I know that we're really peaking at the top of that loan amount, we're not going to look at places with higher property taxes, because that helps me service my clients better. I'm not showing them really shiny houses they can't afford at the end of the day, or put them too close on some of their margins, because I don't want to put them at risk of not getting the financing, and then we've wasted a bunch of time, effort, and energy, and money. So start that relationship early, just FYI, and that way you just service your clients so much better. The next section is the appraisal contingency. Here's another contingency that allows your client out of this contract. Again, you've got your inspection contingency, your appraisal contingency is another one, and finance contingency. Basically, this states that the buyer's obligation to close is contingent upon the real estate appraising at or above the final sales price of the real estate. You have the right to obtain at buyer's expense an independent appraisal. So lenders, of course, require an appraisal. If it's a cash deal, your buyer still has the right to perform an appraisal and the right to terminate based on that appraisal. So remember that if you're doing a cash deal. In the event of purchase or cash, this is your timeline as far as how many days, if it's a cash deal, how many days they have to perform that. The time frame set forth for the appraisal, if it's a finance, leans back to this section up here, which is this piece where it talks about the conditional approval, because that's going to be part of that appraisal. So you can't control the timeline that the lender has the appraisal done, performed, and in their system. So this is basically stating that just has to roll into that original timeline. Most of the time, you do not even order an appraisal until you are through inspections and any post-inspection negotiation. Two reasons for that. Number one, your buyer pays for that appraisal out of their pocket. So if it's going to fall through based on inspection, let's not have them waste even more money paying for an appraisal that's going to be useless. And number two, a lot of the time, lenders won't order it until you're through the inspections for that same reason. It's energy and effort for that appraiser. It's a lot of legwork to get to that point for the lender. If that deal's going to bust, nobody wants to waste the time. It's not a hard sell to tell your buyers that, but it's really important that you communicate directly with your loan officer. Once you have the inspection piece locked down, make sure that they're ordering that appraisal. Make sure you're on top of it. Those can really lead to some significant delays, especially lately. Inclusions and exclusions of sale. Oh, bloop, appraisal. If appraisal comes in low, which we've seen a lot of, there's really, and I educate my clients about this ahead of time, especially for in multiples, there's 4 roads. You've got low appraisal, so you can bring extra cash to the table as a buyer to meet that sale price. The seller can come all the way down to the appraised value. You can meet somewhere in the middle. You can split the baby, or you can't come to agreement. Seller says, I won't take less. Buyer says, I won't bring more. And the contract terminates. That's the appraisal contingency. That is not something that your buyer is penalized against based on the terms of the contract. But know that a low appraisal is not the kiss of death always. Most of the time, sellers are incentivized to work with the buyer, especially if they've been off the market for 3 weeks, especially if you're a nice solid buyer outside of that. They're taking some risk going back on market, trying to get a better appraisal the next time. So don't give up. If it's a low appraisal, really fight for your buyer and make sure that that listing agent feels stupid if they go back on market. Because it's important to make sure that your client is advocated for. We're not going to advocate for the appraiser to up their price usually, unless it's laughably low. But a good listing agent will present a case to their seller and often can bring it together. So don't give up. Inclusions, exclusions of sale. I'm not going to read through all of this. You can read through it, but basically all of the fixtures in a property are included in a sale unless they're going to be specifically excluded. So this goes through all of the items that we're talking about. If the seller goes through and dismantles the property, it's a real problem. I've had sellers remove a bathroom mirror. You can't do that kind of thing. So make sure that your buyer knows what fixtures are and what aren't fixtures. There is a very specific case where the TVs are not fixtures. However, the brackets or the mounts that are inserted in the wall are a fixture. So if you're at a final walkthrough and you see a bunch of ugly TV mounts, congratulations, buyer, that's yours. You bought that. Couple good reasons. Number one, removing those puts really big holes in the drywall. So sellers aren't incentivized to remove them. And secondly, most of us have a flat screen and most of them are universal. And most of the time your buyer is going to put the TV right there. It makes their life easy. Sell it. It's a good thing. This is a section where you can list other specific exclusions. For example, if there's grandma's chandelier in the foyer, specifically you want to list that here. You want to make sure, because lighting fixtures are an inclusion based on the paragraph, make sure you're being very specific if there are exclusions and also inclusions. These would include your appliances most often, oven, range, refrigerator, microwave, dishwasher, garbage disposal. Those are typical inclusions that'll be in the MLS. Washers and dryers are a little, I'd say maybe 50-50, but you can negotiate it in if your buyers need it. I would stop there on this inclusion. If there are other items that convey, such as a hot tub or some larger items, pool tables are big because nobody wants to move those. I would not put those on this contract. I would list those on a separate addendum, mainly because most of your lenders will not approve of those items being part of a purchase because they consider them personal property, and lenders do not want to lend on personal property. So if you put them on this original contract to make sure they're included, the lender may ask you for an addendum that removes them. Just FYI. But you want to make sure if your buyer, if they are included or if they're negotiated in, that you have an addendum signed by everyone to make sure that your buyer will obtain those. This is more of a lending piece where they may not want to see those listed on the contract. So just be really clear on that. Make sure everybody's on the same page. And when at your final walkthrough, if there are specific items that are included, make sure they remain. Also, if I excluded your big nasty splintery playset from the backyard and it's still on property, hey seller, get this off property before closing. We excluded this. We do not want it. So it works both ways. Just make sure you're protecting your buyer. The next section talks about your certification of ownership. This is basically the seller certifying that they do own the property free and clear, and that they also are allowed to sell this property as the owners. You're going to basically go through and complete this based on the information in the MLS for the sellers. I love that they have finally listed this out this way. This used to all be in one single paragraph, and I can't tell you how often these boxes get missed. But you're basically going off of the information provided by the MLS. So you're going to check these boxes accordingly. If the seller says, oh, but wait, there are toxic, explosive, or hazardous substances on the property, I'm going to change that to, to yes as the listing agent, and we're going to talk through that. As the buyer's agent, you're not doing a whole bunch of research to find these things out. You're making assumptions based on the listing, and they will be corrected based on the listing agent and the seller's information, and that would be a discussion. I've had some buyer's agents who get really nervous about these items. This is to the best of our knowledge. There's not a whole lot that we can do. We're not mind readers. So do your best, and then it's on the seller to affirm if there are corrections needed. Same with homeowners associations. Do your due diligence there. Make sure you have the information. But again, it really is, if the seller has knowledge of an assessment that's coming, you may not know about that. Obviously, at the time of the listing agent may not have that in MLS. It's really on them to notify you if that's something that they're aware of. They are obligated to disclose. Just make sure that you read through this and understand what needs to happen as far as HOA documents. Again, here's another timeline. If it is a member of an HOA, they need to provide your buyer with those documents, those covenants, any amendments that they have. This actually gets into a little bit more detail as far as financial statements. Honestly, in practice, I very rarely get the budget for an HOA, especially smaller ones. They may not have access to it. It may simply be an Excel spreadsheet. Just know that there's a wide variety of those coming down the pipe. But most often you will receive the covenants and the restrictions. You'll also receive the information on how to make improvements. If your clients want to add a fence or do those types of things, they'll need to go through the proper channels with HOA. You indicate that the seller has X amount of days, beginning the date after the contract acceptance date, to provide those documents to your buyers. Then your buyers have the right to review and also disapprove within another specific calendar day period. I normally give them 3 calendar days to get me the documents, and I give my buyers 3 calendar days to review. I also follow up with my buyers to make sure that they review them and tell me yes or no. This is a part that sometimes is missed. Number one, I share them via dot loop so I can creep on my buyers and see if they've opened them. If they haven't opened them after about a day, I tell them, hey, we need to open these and read these. And then I reach out again if I don't hear anything back and say, hey, we really need to respond and let the listing agent know if there's anything we disapprove of in here. 99% of the time, they glance at them and they approve it. But again, that's a timeline that you need to make sure you circle through and close with that listing agent and give your clients the opportunity. If there's something unacceptable, they can release the contract based on those documents. So that's a third way that they can get out of that contract if it's not acceptable. Basically, this states no response is acceptance. So remember that if you don't say a word after this calendar day passes, you're good to go. You cannot continue to terminate after that based on the HOA documents. Buyer should pay for all fees. So this piece here, so your buyer's going to have some prorated HOA fees that are going to come through there. There's also going to be a letter that comes from the HOA. It's called a status letter. The seller has to pay for that. They're ridiculously expensive. It's basically a letter that states that the seller's up to date as far as paid HOA fees or no liens. Those are all handled by title. You are not involved in that process. That is title talking to the HOA. But just be aware that if there's an additional fee or a startup fee, or some of the newer HOAs have basically like a capital investment for all new buyers who come in, oh, it's $500 right at the start to help with our capital account. Then you have your HOA fees. Make sure that they're aware they may have to pay additional fees, and that's on the buyer. Oh, this talks about the status letter here. Ooh, that got big. Next section talks about maintenance. Sellers who, especially with vacant properties, sometimes we do have some hiccups with sellers who fail to maintain the property during the process of the deal. Until physical possession is delivered to the buyer, seller shall continue to maintain the real estate. That means making sure that everything is in operational form the way it was originally. That also means taking care of the yard and taking care of the house, so that your buyer doesn't walk into a bunch of just crap. So in this section, it does give a blank that talks about except. I always put no exceptions. I want everything maintained properly by the seller. I'm not going to ask my buyer to take on anything additional. So this blank needs to be completed with no exceptions. This also talks about the final walkthrough, which is a right granted in the contract. It's always kind of been there. We've always all assumed it. This is some time for the buyer to walk through the property, make sure that it's still acceptable. Also, it may be that they're peeking about inspection items too. That's a time to do that as well. Home warranties, you may or may not love them. I do like them. They cover some things. They're not perfect, just like me and everyone else in the world. They do help in certain instances, plumbing, electric, things like that, furnaces, hot water heaters. I like HSA. I think we use Cinch warranty with Plumtree. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, a listing will have a home warranty already. It'll be a sale piece, especially if it's an older house with some older mechanicals. It's a little bit of assurance for your buyers that, yeah, that hot water heater, it is 17 years old, but it works. But we also have a home warranty, so you're covered for the next year. If it does break, you can lean on the home warranty. So it's helpful. It gives your buyers some assurance. You can ask that the seller pay for that. Buyer selects or does not select, provided by blank, whoever your company is, and then paid for. This used to be a checkbox, but you can put buyer or seller. And then if it's seller, you can put the amount not to exceed. So get the annual cost for the home warranty and include that there. That's going to come right out of the seller's proceeds at closing as a line item on the settlement statement. So you will have to provide the title company with the invoice for that home warranty, just FYI. Property disclosure form. This is usually attached to the MLS listing. This is required unless the seller is exempt from that. If it's a executrix or executor or trust or something like that, where the seller actually doesn't have any of that knowledge or guardianship, they may be exempt. Most of the time they're not. Make sure that your buyer reviews that prior to executing a contract. Don't make your life hard. Buyer's offsite acknowledgement.
Text me if you have any questions about that, by the way.
Yeah.
Sometimes you might not know, and we want to get that right. So text me if you have questions. So
yeah. So the next section, the offsite acknowledgement, basically, this gets into that grayish fair housing area where we really can't talk toward crime statistics. We can't talk toward sex offenders. We don't talk toward neighborhood, schools, all of those pieces. This basically states that not only do the agents not make any claims or statements with regard to the offsite details and facts about this property, the seller also is not making any of those claims. So ask your buyers to do their due diligence. Google is a beautiful tool. But this basically states that the buyer's relying on their own research, and I would definitely err on the side of caution and lean heavily on avoiding those types of answers to a large degree. If they live by an airport and a month after they move in, they find out that it's super duper loud, they're going to squeak to you about it, but there's nothing that you can do, for example. It's not your job to do that kind of thing. That's a buyer task. This section is new and exciting. Not new as far as concept, but new as far as details. So the inspection contingency is another way for your buyer, if they find something unacceptable, to remove themselves from the contract. Yes, always do inspections, always. If the question is asked, should we waive inspections? My answer is never. You can take a property as is. Perfect, great. Do not waive inspections. Number one, that pulls some liability from me as the agent. And it also, I want my buyers to feel good in their home. I do not want there to be big questions. If there's mold, I want to know about it before my buyer buys that property. So I have to be able to sleep at night, is what I tell my buyers. So inspections are important in order to understand what you're really buying. Everything that you can see is not always what you're getting. So yes, if you waive inspections, you really are doing a disservice to your client, in my opinion. Investors are very different, wholly different animal. I'm talking about your normal run-of-the-mill consumer buyers. So basically, buyers' inspections are at buyer's expense. Ohio home inspectors need to be licensed. That is a requirement. Also, the law states if you recommend one inspector, you must recommend 3 inspectors to your client. So make sure you've got a short list to provide to them. If the answer is, I don't provide inspectors to my buyers, that's the wrong answer, because they're going to go out and Google, and all inspectors are not created equally. You need to provide your clients with 3 respected, good inspectors that you work with and trust for a lot of reasons. Do not leave them floating out there to find an inspector, please. If you need inspectors, call me. I have a short list I will share with you. This section is in bold because it's super duper important. They don't bold the whole contract, they just bold the really important parts. This is basically talking about anything that happens to that property during inspections is the buyer's fault, or the inspector's liable for it. Just be mindful that that sometimes happens. It's very rare, and most good inspectors are very cautious. They will not, oh, hey, I couldn't get the fireplace to turn on. Oh, well, you have to, all you had to do was wiggle this. Inspectors are not going to wiggle this because they may break this. And so it can be frustrating at times, but understand that they're not trying to destroy the house. So, and they're in enough houses that they know what to do and not do. They're not stupid.
Although I had an inspector one time who was inspecting the attic. He fell through the ceiling in the master bedroom and never told anyone, and he left. and so
they won't notice that.
The homeowners came home, they're like, what the heck? We got a hole in our ceiling.
Oh my gosh.
So we had to go after him, and he paid for it. But
yeah, you think. I had a seller that did that because he was just going to peek at the electric in the attic before the inspection. Never done it before, just trying to do the right thing. Fell through a 2-story great room ceiling, and the repair for that ended up costing almost $10,000 by the time they had to repaint the entire vaulted ceiling.
Wow.
So advise your sellers, you're not an inspector.
That's
terrible.
Stay
out of the attic. It was awful. But I digress. So this is really important. And again, this comes from educating your buyers before everything happens. The buyer understands and agrees that the inspection report is not considered a list of required repairs or corrections. You're going to see everything on that report, from doors that don't shut properly because it's humid outside, to, a loose railing or things like that, to major defects. You have to make sure your buyer understands what this report is. A lot of new home buyers, or first-time buyers especially, get really spooked when they see a 78-page inspection report on their perfect little house that they thought they fell in love with. No home is perfect. Even new builds have ugly inspections. Educate your buyers. Use an inspector who does not inflate things or frighten buyers, because it's really important they understand it's a house, it's a home. Every home, if they think back to their childhood, their dad probably had to do certain, my dad and I would use the shop vac in the basement when the basement would flood. In hindsight, should have had a sump pump, but no house is perfect. And so that's part of what makes it a home. Make them understand that. This is not a list of 78 pages that is going to be repaired by the seller. Not happening. Some of this is information. I tell my buyers, go to that inspection. This is the best education about this house you're ever going to have. Let that inspector answer questions, show them where the main water shutoff is, show them things about their electric box. This is a good inspector helping your home buyers be good homeowners. They'll talk about maintenance. They'll talk about making sure you clean your gutters. They'll talk about making sure that your downspouts go away from the foundation. Those aren't inspection items. That's just good homeowner training. Let your inspector do that for you, because it's important. And the buyers are always thankful. You say, wow, I feel really good. If there's a water leak, I know where to shut off the water. You'd be amazed. That's super important. You don't want to waste time hunting in the basement for the shutoff. Personally, I do not attend home inspections for multiple reasons. Number one, to find a 3-hour block in my schedule is laughable. Number two, I am not the smartest person in the room then, and I don't like it. So what am I going to do? I'm going to sit there and look pretty, right? No, I'm not going to sit there and try to act like I know more than the inspector. I'm not going to sit there and work on my laptop. It really is not a good show if I tell you I trust my inspector, but I need to be there to supervise them. So I want you to trust what this inspector tells us on that report. I have to show you I trust them too. I do not attend inspections. That is a personal preference for me. We are not required to attend inspections. It's up to you, but that would be my 2 cents if you ask for it.
Can I put a little footnote on there?
Yeah, of course.
I agree with you on all that. However, if there's a new agent and you're just getting in the business and you're watching this, what I did, I probably attended the first 20 inspections of the first 20 houses that I sold. And I learned so much about the mechanics of a house and how decks should be attached to the house. And I learned so much about
and none of them are attached right.
Yeah, right. How to detect mold and stuff. So I learned so much through that, that when I was a showing agent or a buyer's agent, when we're taking people through houses, I could point at things and say, well, you see that? That's mold. And here's how you know that. Here's how you can tell if the crack is a good crack or a bad crack. And, so I became a teacher, and that helped me a bunch. But I do agree. There is some liability if you go to inspections where then all of a sudden you're part of the problem. Now you have to disclose certain things, and you don't necessarily want to be in that. That's good if that's on the buyer, and with that little footnote there.
Yeah, right. Always good to protect yourself. But and to your point, yes, I have been. If my clients are out of town buyers or elderly or something like that, there's always exceptions to the rule. I definitely do it on a case-by-case basis, but you're right. It is a great education moment. And you can learn a lot from your inspector. And I have a good inspector that you can kind of use as a phone a friend. I jokingly call them that. If I have clients, like a new build, for example, and they visit the site and they send me pictures, well, I just send those to my inspector and I ask him, hey, is this normal? And then he says, yeah, it's code, but it's kind of sloppy. I turn around and I'm like, yeah, I feel like that's code, but it's kind of sloppy. Oh my God. It's a great relationship, and it's really great to have a great inspector on your team. So, and treat them as such, treat them well. So back to educating buyers on these inspections, there are 5 things that I educate my buyers that we normally would request for repairs. Water is the enemy of all construction. Structural issues as far as roof, basement, windows, things like that. Biogrowth, safety items such as mold, radon, those types of things. Kind of general concern items that your clients feel are just unacceptable. And then the other piece is like pests, wood destroying insects and things like that. Things outside of that, I do try to prep them that they're not going to be inspection items we're going to ask the seller to remedy. And as a listing agent, I indicate we need to repair defects. We need to make sure that the house is sound and it's safe, but we're not going to entertain some of these things. And I like that this new contract really gets into that a little bit deeper. It takes some of that education and it puts it right here for everybody to see, but still understand you're dealing with humans. So make sure that you're communicating the way that they understand. So also lead-based paint, if it's built before 1978, your seller does have to complete that disclosure if they have any knowledge. Most of the time they have no knowledge, but then the buyer needs to sign off on that. We scroll down here. I again, don't waive it. Don't do it. I wouldn't even do a limited inspection. I don't feel like that's appropriate. Full inspection of the real estate. It basically gives you carte blanche inspection, short of destructive testing. So make sure that your buyers are aware of that. If there's a pool, if there's a septic system, if there's, radon, mold, those are separate tests, sometimes separate inspectors. You want to make sure that they have the right to have all of those types of things done. Your general home inspector does not do pool inspections. He's not they'll check out the septic, but they're not really as qualified, and they'll be the first to tell you that. This is your inspection period. This is a really big timeline piece because based on the availability of your inspector and getting results back, you want to give yourself time to do those things. So if you're up against a weekend, pad those calendar days a little bit because most inspectors don't work on the weekend. So if it's Friday or it's Thursday and I need to get an inspection in 7 days, I may be 4 days deep before I can even make that happen. So be mindful. I normally do 7. I'll do 10 if I can justify that to the listing agent as far as a weekend or a holiday. Going much beyond that makes sellers very nervous. They don't want to be off market with the opportunity for the buyer to terminate for 2 weeks. That's going to be a tough sell for them. After that point, so you have your inspections, you get your results back. I always recommend a biogrowth or a mold inspection. I always recommend radon. It's a colorless, odorless gas. Even if there is a mitigation system, we want to make sure that it's functioning properly. I always recommend those. Termites always going to be part of it. Most lenders require those anyway. The other piece that a lot of people forget about is your sewer line. That is a scope that actually goes down there. That line is the buyer's responsibility up from the house up to the main connection. Really the only way to see inside of it is to probe it with a camera and make sure that there aren't obstructions or breakages, because that is a bad surprise to have after closing. So those are kind of my 3 big ones. They are a bit of an additional cost, but when it comes to making those repairs or finding mold after closing, it's well worth the expense. So make sure that your buyers understand that. Once you receive all of your results back, all of your reports, you go through those with your buyers, and there's a separate class on that because inspections are a whole other animal. You want to make sure that you're going through finding defects that really could be detrimental or could be a major issue for your client, highlighting those, talking through remedies with your buyers, and then you execute what now is called the defect notice. We used to call it the post-inspection addendum. And here it is. Love this. Minor routine maintenance and cosmetic items are not to be considered material, and they may not object to those in the defect notice. So nobody cares if the wall's ugly with, spackle from patched holes. Not something that's going to be a defect notice. If the wall's crumbling because of structural issues, yes, that is a defect. So be sure that you talk to your clients about this stuff. Dirty gutters, while horrific and silly, can sometimes fall under routine maintenance. However, if it's creating a leak, then you got a defect. So understand that some of these could be under that umbrella. It's just really important to know how to educate your buyers on that. Once you submit that defect notice to your sellers, this ends the inspection period. So let me be really clear. So if I have a 10-day inspection period, and I get all my reports and I get all my inspections back at day 8. And I talk with my buyers. I submit the defect notice to the listing agent on day 8. My inspection period's over. You don't get 2 more days. That's it. You are ending the inspection period upon delivering either the defect notice or what's called the notice of satisfaction. Basically, if there's no repairs requested, you're saying, hey, waiving that inspection contingency, we're good to go. Let's move forward. I'd love more of those in my life, but they're not as common. Help me find some houses that have those. So it's really important to remember and make sure, again, your clients may say, oh, but we've got 1 more day. I forgot I wanted to do a pool inspection. Ooh, too late. We already provided that. So make sure you're educating them that once we provide this, that shuts that door. We don't get that right. Once that happens, so this is a new kind of piece here. Once you provide that defect notice to the seller, this is new and I love it. The seller has a period of up to blank calendar days, which is now called the consideration period, beginning the day following the delivery of the defect notice to evaluate the request. This puts some pressure on that seller to respond because there have been sellers in the past, if it's a 5-day settlement period, they may not even respond to that until day 4, be obstructive, and now we're down to 1 day. And it puts pressure on my buyers and backs them into a corner and makes me angry. This takes care of that. This says, hey, seller, you have a consideration period wherein you must respond to me. And only once you respond, does the other settlement period start. So it's a new timeline. So make sure you're aware, but it also keeps those sellers honest because they can't just be obstructive and make us wait till the last minute to actually respond. I would maybe give them 2 days max. You don't need to sit on this. You're going to know your response within an hour of reading it. So if the seller has that notice, they have, prior to the end of that consideration period, 2 options. Provide the buyer a signed written agreement to correct all defects in the manner detailed, which would be phenomenal, or, which is more often, a counteroffer. We asked for 4 things. The seller is going to counter with 2.5. Cool, great. If the seller fails to timely provide any required written notice to buyer, seller shall be deemed to have agreed to correct defects in the manner detailed and requested in buyer's defect notice. How awesome is that? So if you give them 2 calendar days, they choose to be obstructive or forget that there's a consideration period now, and we think we have 5 days on a settlement period, they do not respond. They have, in effect, by not responding, agreed to correct all defects in the manner detailed by buyer. So again, it helps to know what you're asking for and to hold the seller to it. This could be a big deal. So if they respond and it's a counter, hey, we'll do 2.5 out of the 4, great. Then you have what we called originally and always the settlement period. So the settlement period is the timeline basically where you go back and forth and renegotiate to come back to terms. I would give yourself business days. Simply because, again, not much gets done on the weekend. If you need to call an HVAC, if you need to call a roofer, if you need to call an electrician, you're really going to lose days if 2 of those days you can't get a hold of anybody. So I normally put 3, but I scratch out calendar and I put business. It gives everybody enough time to make good decisions, but it also doesn't tie our hands with 2 days of those being weekend days. So I would say 2 days for consideration period, 3 business days for the settlement period is probably appropriate. Again, you get much longer. If there's something super complicated, buyer and seller usually can align and say, hey, we need to extend the settlement period. We need a roofing quote. Everybody's inclined to keep on pace.
So assuming that you have a deal where you're going to be submitting inspection items for potential repair or defects, Once you submit what's now called the defect notice, it used to be called a post-inspection addendum. It's now indicated to be the defect notice. You present that to the seller. This is a new period that's in this new contract, which I really like, because this gives the seller a period of up to blank amount of calendar days. So we've set a new timeline for the seller wherein they need to respond to this request. Before, you could have a seller who could push to the very last day of the settlement period, and outside of you squeaking at them, they really weren't forced to respond. And they could push you right up to the end of the settlement period and really kind of hold your buyers hostage. Well, with this, we now have a period that's been inserted called the consideration period, which basically lets you determine at contract inception how many days that seller has to consider the defect notice you've provided. And there's two roads. Number one, so this begins again the day following the delivery of the defect notice. So take note that that's the day after. Prior to the end of the consideration period, seller shall either A, provide buyer a signed written agreement to correct all defects in the manner detailed, or provide a counter offer, basically indicating that they're going to do 1, 2, and 4, but not 3, 5, and 6, or however that would come out in the wash. This is also especially important to note here. If delivery of the notice in this section shall designate the end of the consideration period. In the event that the seller shall fail to timely provide any required written notice, seller shall be deemed to have agreed to correct defects in the manner detailed and requested in buyer's defect notice. So the default, if the seller does not respond within this consideration period, the default basically is we accept, all good. We're going to do it all in the manner that you requested. So sellers are really incentivized to respond. Otherwise, they by proxy just assume that they're going to do everything as you've requested. So let's say that the seller counters. So you've provided defect notice. The seller is going to counter. That begins section C. In the event that seller has timely delivered to buyer a counter offer, the parties shall have blank calendar days. So this is a term that we're all familiar with already. This is now the settlement period. So for example, you could have an inspection period of, let's say, 7 calendar days. Now you've got a consideration period of what I would say maximum maybe 2 calendar days to give that seller time to respond. Then that starts the quote unquote settlement period, which is a separate timeline. I like to do my settlement periods in business days, simply because falling on a weekend can sometimes eat up that time if we need to connect with laborers, if we need to gather quotes or further information from experts. Calendar days really could all fall on a weekend and really tie your hands when you're representing your buyer. So I will often, instead of just putting 3 calendar days, I'll often put 3 business and cross out calendar, just to give us all the time that we need to make sure that we're coming to a really good and solid agreement where everyone's informed, so that everybody feels like it was a fair and an honorable agreement. So you now have 3 sections, 3 chunks of that inspection, post-inspection period. Delivery of any mutually signed, written, and accepted counter offer for correction of defects or for no correction during the settlement period shall end the settlement period. So once we all agree, whether we've got a day or 2 left, doesn't matter. Same with the inspection period. Once we're all signed, once we're locked and loaded, we're done. That's the end of the settlement period. In the event that the parties fail to reach a mutual signed written agreement, this contract shall automatically terminate. So this goes back to the buyer's contingencies to exit the contract. We have the right to exit based on inspections, period. We'll get more into that. But also if we fail to come to agreement based on those inspection requests. This next section, oh, go ahead, Chris, sorry.
One of the things I'll just highlight there is this might be common mistake number 1 that new agents make, is that let's say you have, let's just call it 10 days for the inspection period, and let's just call it 5 days for the settlement period. I wouldn't do those numbers, but some agents look at that and they think, oh, that's 15 days total that we have to get the inspection report to them. And that's not true. You have to get that inspection report to them and request for repairs prior to the end of the inspection period. So you can't just add those together. That's the point. And I see that all the time from new agents. So you want to be careful, because then as the agent, you become liable if you goof up the deal because you didn't watch that deadline. So make sure you get your post-inspection addendum to them before the end of the inspection period. So
absolutely, good point. And if you remember, by not delivering that before the end of the inspection period, the converse of this seller side is true. You basically have accepted the property as is. So you may be locking your buyers into an inability to request repairs based on inspections with a mistake like that. So good point, Chris. It's definitely pay attention to timelines, remember? This section D, is new and exciting, because I feel like this is going to be really awesome for some sellers, and it's going to be really nightmarish for some buyers. Previously, basically, buyers had the ability and the right to terminate based on inspections with no proof, with nothing outside of, we terminate based on inspections, have a great day. Obviously, sellers probably had a problem with that, and that started some issues. So this paragraph really kind of deep dives into the specific process by which you're permitted to do that and not. And I'm going to add a couple things in this when I represent buyers as well. So this section is really important. So notwithstanding the foregoing, this section provides limited circumstances in which a buyer may elect to not provide a defect notice to seller. It may unilaterally terminate this contract without further opportunity for seller's correction of defects. That's a big deal. So in the event that buyer's inspections reveal real estate conditions, which conditions are not disclosed by seller prior to contract acceptance date, and that evidence one or more of the following specific matters. Now, so this goes into, so basically what they're saying is buyers can no longer say, based on inspections, we're out. They have to provide the seller an opportunity to correct. And really, it puts a little bit more teeth with the sellers to have some opportunity to keep this deal together, versus what typically ends up being buyers' cold feet. And then the inspection is the get out of jail free part, is really where I feel like this probably came from. I don't know if you know more about that than I do, Chris, but to me, that's what this feels like, is a way to kind of close that door so that we really have to prove property condition was at the heart of that termination versus just buyers changed their mind.
Yep. Lots of people were changing their minds just because they had buyer's remorse.
Yeah.
And that's not really good enough reason.
Right. It's a contract, right? So so basically, in the event that the buyer's inspections reveal real estate conditions which are not disclosed by seller prior to the contract acceptance date, so these conditions go into conditions adversely affecting the structural integrity of the building, the presence of asbestos, the presence of lead-based paint, and the presence of any other hazardous materials as defined below, and or other. And this is kind of an interesting box. So we'll go back to that. And the buyer does not wish to provide defect notice to seller in accordance with section 14A. Then prior to the end of the inspection period, buyer shall deliver to seller a signed written notification to terminate the contract, which is contract termination notice. We've all seen that. But now we also have to identify the specific condition together with the relevant portion of the buyer's inspection report evidencing the existence of such condition. So not only are we kind of limited on these items, now they're saying, well, now you have to prove it to me. Prove to me the condition that's unacceptable that falls under one of these. Otherwise, you don't just get to go on a quote unquote honor system and say, oh, it's a structural problem. You have to now provide that to the seller or to the listing agent. Upon timely delivery to seller of the contract termination notice, this contract shall be terminated. So be sure that your buyers really understand this. This goes back to that education piece where we all should be educating our buyers ahead of time. You are signing a legally binding contract. This is not something to take lightly. I'm assuming we're all coaching our clients as such anyway, but this is really important that they understand these are the reasons you can just terminate based on inspection. Outside of these, you're really going to have some struggles claiming that earnest money if you just have cold feet. We're going to have to find a reason that matches these in order to not move forward. And then it goes into a little bit more detail. For the purposes of this subsection, hazardous material means substances defined as hazardous substances. Hazardous materials or toxic substances under federal, state, or local law, asbestos or formaldehyde, really nasty chemicals, or any other chemical material substance exposure to which is prohibited, limited, or regulated by any governmental authority imposes a hazard to the health or safety of the occupants of the real estate. So it's some very specific safety items, if I have an umbrella term that I would put over top of that, that are allowing the buyer basically to just cancel outright without giving the seller the opportunity to correct. This doesn't take away the buyer's ability to request defect correction for those items, but it also allows the buyer to terminate simply based on those. So just make sure that, and the big thing that comes up for me with this is mold, which I would actually, I don't see that listed. There could be some gray area as far as how that particular mold or biogrowth is categorized. So me, when I'm representing buyers, I will be also adding in a section under other that says, or any other condition deemed unacceptable by the buyers. Now, as a buyer's agent, that gives my buyer the right to cancel for reasons they find unacceptable. However, as a listing agent, I'm not going to love that written into this contract blank. So understand that that may come back as a counter, but for me, I feel like I want to give my clients the reasonable ability to terminate if they just will not feel comfortable in the house, even if certain things are corrected. And that's a conversation you have to have with your buyers. Chris, what are your thoughts on that? What are your plans to manage that?
Yeah, that's the tough one, and really, it's hard to. I don't know if I like this specificity or not, because when I have worked with buyers, I like to be able to just say, "Hey, we looked at the inspection report, we're out." Right. Because and that's good in situations where maybe it's a rehab, and once you start getting in, you can just tell they did a really terrible job with the rehab. Trying to figure out what's the best word to use for that, but they did a bad job on the rehab, and you can just tell the quality of everything sucks, and so. And it's hard to specify on one of these little things. Just you can't really say, well, we just thought the quality of everything was terrible. So that's one thing I like about the previous contract. With this one having to specify, it's definitely good for the sellers, and it's also good even if as a buyer's agent. I've had clients who were just kind of weren't taking it seriously. And it helps, gives me leverage. Hey, you're under contract and you can't just jump out for any reason. So it helps keep them anchored into the transaction, protects my interests as well. But I think under that other section, you could put that does give a lot of latitude for what you would write into there, I would think. So
Yeah. Which it'll, again, I think this will be interesting in practice to see
yeah,
how this starts to really come about. But to your point, yeah, it definitely helps put some teeth into what you tell your clients as far as education about this is a legally binding contract. But I always, and I even said this in the in-person class, I had a family whose daughters were they just had horrible asthma. And so the mold test that came back, whereas we'll normally ping just fine for most of us, it could have really adversely affected these little girls. And so I would hate to be a buyer representative locking horns over, well, how hazardous is that mold and how, hazardous, quote unquote. So I will be adding that in. And to your point, if you walk into a flip and just everything, nothing's plumb, nothing's squared, the cumulative data from the inspection report, it's not any one thing, but there's no way a seller could effectively correct all of the crappy workmanship. What can't we see? How long until the plumbing pipe glue gives way because you just did it improperly? That has some validity too. And I feel like the buyers should be protected still. I like that sellers are protected, but I also feel like this will be a fun one to watch actually come to fruition in reality once it starts kind of getting out there a little bit more. So I appreciate the effort that the board has made to protect our sellers, though. I really think that they're making a step in the right direction with that.
Another common thing I hear from I see is buyers will get into a contract and then they find another home that they like better. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, so the agent, they're coming to me, say, hey, my seller wants to kill the contract because they found a different house. And so sometimes they'll try to use the inspection to get out of the contract so they can go buy another house. So this helps to put teeth into the contract as well, just to make sure that they understand this legally binding contract. And the other thing is, if they get out of the contract, if they're trying to get out of the contract, it may not be just a loss of earnest money. There could be damages, and that could be tens of thousands of dollars. So people need to understand that when they're trying to break a contract, they say, oh, we're okay, we'll just give up the earnest money. It might be bigger than that. So
yeah, if you go back to that earnest money section, it very specifically states that may not be the only repercussion that the other party has, which I think is fair. I definitely think is fair. So definitely the thread throughout this new contract and contract training is educating your clients, whether they're sellers or buyers, and making sure that they're aware of their obligations to the contract and potential pitfalls and potential penalties if they don't perform. And ignorance isn't an excuse in legal contract terms. So just make sure you're taking good care of your clients on both sides of that fence. So once we're all through inspections, which again is a significant amount of timeline at this point, we also have some other sections in here. A property survey isn't always required. It usually is determined by the lender and sometimes by the title underwriter. It just depends. But this section pertains to the possibility of a survey. Buyer acknowledges that it is buyer's responsibility to confirm the location of boundary lines and or to confirm the location of improvements relative to such lines. Buyer at buyer's expense shall obtain any survey of the real estate desired by buyer and or required by buyer's lender. So to this point, buyer has the right to perform a survey, which can be a little bit expensive, but they also must pay for a survey if it's a requirement of underwriting. So, and that's what this section says. So be sure that you educate your clients there. Different lenders have different parameters. If it hasn't been surveyed in a while, you may be asked to have a survey performed. So just make sure they're aware that that's a thing. And if it's a thing that happens, you can revisit. Hey, remember we talked about survey might be possible. Well, here we are. If buyer desires for buyer's obligations under this contract to be contingent upon buyer's satisfactory review of evidence of survey, buyer must complete any desired survey and proceed in accordance with the timelines and process stated section 14 herein. Any survey evidence required by lender is not subject to buyer's inspection contingency and may still impact lender's terms and conditions to lend. What does that mean? It basically means if it's the buyer's desire to have the survey performed, they must do so during the inspection period, and it falls under that timeline and category. If that becomes a requirement of the lender, it's not subject to the inspection contingency, because that may fall well outside of the inspection timeline through no control of the buyer. And it also is important to understand that if there's an issue with that survey or something like that, that could affect the lender's conditions to lend. So it could be a part of some of those conditions of approval, but that's separate and apart from an inspection period. So that basically just separates those two. If it's a buyer's desire, put it under the inspection. If it's a lender requirement, totally different bucket, but could still have some negative repercussions depending on what comes back. And your buyer will get a copy of that survey since they pay for that. So make sure that you request that. It will normally be ordered by title and it'll go to your title company, but make sure that your buyer gets a copy of that. Because down the road, if they decide to put a fence in, a lot of fencing companies require a survey. Surveys aren't cheap. They can be $1,000 and more. So make sure that your buyer's funds aren't wasted. They have a copy of that survey that they can use down the road if they need some boundary information. So, but title takes care of all of the ordering of that based on instruction from the lender. Now, if it's a buyer request, I would still reach out to title because they have surveyors that they work with often and could refer you. But the process would be just a little bit different. That would not necessarily be managed by title at that point. Property insurance verification contingency. So this is a change from our original contract that we've all been used to. Everybody knows that when you purchase a property, you need to have that property insured, especially if it's through a lender that's required. But even if you purchase cash, you should really have your buyers protect their investment. Buyer acknowledges that it is the buyer's sole responsibility to make inquiries and confirm availability and cost of any and all policies of insurance reasonably desired by buyer and or required by buyer's lender. So that's that section, including but not limited to hazard, flood, and personal property insurance. This is big. Buyer is relying on buyer's own understanding of insurance to be obtained. So much like we are not real estate attorneys, title specialists, lenders, loan officers, we're also not insurance agents. So make sure you have a good insurance agent you can refer your buyers to if they need one to answer questions pertaining to their property insurance. It's more complicated than it needs to be, but we want to make sure we're getting them to the right experts who can answer their questions and get them the right coverage. This timeline is separate and apart now from the inspection period, whereas before, this was part of their inspection period timeline where they sought and were able to obtain acceptable coverage for the property. Now this is a totally separate timeline. Now the buyer has 14 calendar days, regardless of inspection timeline, regardless of whether it's as is, no inspections, whether they're waived. The buyer has 14 calendar days beginning the day following the contract acceptance date that such insurance policies are available and that the cost is acceptable to buyer and buyer's lender. Ooh, that's a big deal because this here, 14 calendar days, you could be well past inspections, you could be well past settlement period. This could be an unacceptable occurrence for your buyer or the lender. The reason that it could be unacceptable to the buyer's lender could have a lot to do with the ratios that are very specifically calculated with regard to a buyer's income for the month and the outflow for the month as far as their dwelling costs, which is principal, interest, homeowners insurance, and property taxes. So your buyer's lender needs this information ASAP to make sure that if property insurance is very high, that it doesn't throw their ratios out of whack and actually make it so that that buyer cannot afford this house, even though it may be well below their max loan limit. So really important to know that that can really be a factor in your buyer's underwriting. So get this information ASAP, especially if it's in a floodplain. That coverage can get really, really expensive. But the other piece is the cost is acceptable to buyer, period. So this is a space where your buyer needs to acknowledge whether they're comfortable with that. It may fall in the ratio, however, it may push their monthly budget just a little bit. So you need to make sure your buyer knows, number one, we have 14 days. Number two, get it done early. And number three, I need to know that this is an acceptable cost to you, because if it's not, we have the right to terminate, but I need to know that before 14 days, because after 14 days, we done. We don't get the right any longer. As long as buyer's lender isn't opposed, you move forward, which is a little deep.
Hey, just a quick comment on that. And I'm glad that you're highlighting this, because this can be a real problem. I've had deals where the floodplain classification changed. And so coming in with the buyer now, there are new policies required for insurance. No one even knew it was going to be an issue until the sale. So, and then it made it impossible for them to get insurance. But then, I've seen it. A lot of people wait until the week before closing to try to do that, and you'll be in trouble. In another situation, I bought an investment property that was like 100-year-old property. It was in a historic district. It was a really nice property. And right before the closing, this back in the olden days when I was young and didn't understand all this, I wasn't licensed, but I found out like a week before that I couldn't find any insurance companies to insure it. And so because of the nature of the property being so old and everything. Right. And so the remedy for that was I went to the sellers and said, well, who did you get to insure it? And I had to go to the same insurance company. So if you get into trouble getting properties insured, that's a path you might want to take. Go to find out who's currently insuring the property.
Right, assuming they have coverage. And the other piece to that, which I actually hadn't touched on, with older homes especially, we're finding more and more insurance companies who will not insure properties with knob and tube wiring. And so this would be really important for your buyer to know ahead of time. If the property has that condition, it may not even be a matter of cost. It may be a matter of getting someone to cover that property, period. Some companies say, I don't want to see any knob and tube, which means if it's in the basement where you can see it between the floor joists, possibly needs removal. But also understand it is likely still in all of the walls. So make sure your buyer's educated on that. But there are some where if it's present on the property, the insurance company will not insure. That is newer. When I bought my first house in 2009, I didn't have any issue finding knob and tube coverage because it was a historic house. But since then, even that same company no longer will insure. So these are little pieces as you're shopping for houses. Make sure you're dropping little bits of knowledge on your client. If it's an older home and we have knob and tube, this could be a struggle for us. Number one, makes you sound like a super expert. Number two, preps them for some of the opportunities they might have in the process that they're not even really thinking about at this point. So, so that's a 14-day timeline to make sure that they can, number one, obtain and afford, and it doesn't throw their lender ratios off. So make sure that they know how important it is to do that early. Like Chris said, we don't have the luxury of waiting until the week before closing, because if your buyer can't find insurance, they're past their window. Does it fall under financing contingency? Could be some gray, but I wouldn't push it if I didn't have to. So, but obviously they could terminate the contract by providing written notification before the expiration of the 14-day calendar period. if the insurance is unacceptable. So by not providing anything, the contingency is waived. So silence is acceptance, as are most of these timelines in here. The next section talks about the seller's obligations to the deal and to the buyer throughout the process. So the seller's cooperation is important because if the seller's obstructing us, we may not hit our timelines, which then could create an issue as far as the contract itself. We're in breach, however, seller needed to cooperate. So if seller agrees to make the real estate available at reasonable hours for access by licensed real estate agents and brokers, and buyers, inspectors, appraisers, and other authorized parties. Sellers shall have all utilities servicing real estate on, and buyer acknowledges that buyer is not authorized to be present on the real estate without a licensed real estate agent unless prior express written authorization is obtained from the seller. Note to self. Now inspectors are required to be licensed in the state of Ohio, but also in the listing agreement, this goes back to, do we attend inspections? I vote no, unless you're there for education or anything like that, but I do not recommend making it a practice. But in the listing agreement, there are sections where the seller signs and initials that they do authorize individuals to enter the property without a licensed agent, as long as they're accompanied by an inspector or possibly even an unlicensed assistant. So I would clarify, just out of respect with the listing agent, whether you intend to be present at the inspection or not, and just make sure everyone's aware. But it really can depend on your listing agent, whether that expectation is there for them. Some sellers want their agent to be there for inspection. I would strongly advise against that. However, it is the seller's property. So just communication is key there, but this basically states that if you've sent over 3 requests for inspections at reasonable dates and times and the seller keeps declining, you may have some obstruction on your hand, and you may need to have their agent remind them that they agreed to cooperate based on the contract. So not your problem, that's the listing agent, but it's your job to make sure that they get that done. The next section is kind of our wide open section. We still have this other contingencies and agreements, where you can check the attached addenda, which are signed by all parties. So this would be a section where I would list whether I have an like an escalation addendum included, or this would be a section where you could put information about perhaps an appraisal gap. You could put that in there. I would be mindful what you put into that, simply because this total contract does go to your lender. So if you start discussing too much personal property and things of that nature in this section, you might get some pushback. But also you want to make sure if there's a specific addenda that is, this sale is contingent upon buyer's satisfaction and verification with the township that the street will not be extended through their side yard. I bring that up because I have a contract with that in place. And it basically allows that buyer to terminate based on their dissatisfaction. So I would check and make sure, see attached buyer contingency addendum regarding street pathways through side yard. So whatever contingencies are in here, make sure you list those as part of this contract, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. The next section is title insurance. This is huge. Title insurance is very, very important. There's 2 types of title insurance. Lender title insurance is required by, I believe, all lenders except for very few specific exceptions like Union Savings, simply because they have a different, it's a title opinion. We won't get into that. We'll go with the norm. So the lender will require that the buyer provide lender title insurance to protect the lender in the event of a title error. Owner's title insurance is optional. So, but I would never let your clients believe it's optional. I feel like it's very important to have on their property some protection for your buyer in the event of a title error. So title insurance is designed to protect the policyholder of such insurance for covered losses caused by defects in title to the real estate that are in existence on the date and time of the policy of title insurance is issued. Title insurance is different from casualty or liability insurance. This isn't homeowners, is basically what they're saying. Buyers encouraged to inquire about the benefits of owner's title from a title insurance agency or provider. An owner's policy, while not required, is recommended. A lender's policy of title insurance, if required by the broker, does not provide protection to the buyer. So make sure that your buyer understands the lender's policy doesn't matter to them. The lender doesn't care if they're protected. They've got to protect themselves. But they're really nice and they pay for the lender's protection with the title insurance. Buyer acknowledges that it's the buyer's sole responsibility to make inquiries with regard to owner's title insurance prior to closing. That all goes through title. Your buyer has the opportunity to purchase that. The running rate, I believe, is about $400 per $100,000 of purchase. I've seen that vary slightly, but that's the benchmark that I give my clients. It's a one-time cost of closing, and it's definitely an additional protection I recommend. You have the opportunity on the contract to request that the seller contribute some of your buyer's title insurance costs. Personally, I don't ask them to do so, but here is where you elect. You can select either buyer does not select an owner's policy of title. Even if we select that they don't select it on the contract, they'll still have the opportunity to purchase it at closing. They will still be permitted to put that in force. So this doesn't eliminate that right for them at closing. I haven't met a seller to date who my buyers wanted to add owner's title insurance at closing, and the seller says, wait, you didn't put that on the contract, you can't add that. Seller does not care. I don't know if Chris has, but I haven't met a single seller who cared.
Nope.
You know, not yet, right? And then second,
no, but I do agree with you. I do agree with you that I would recommend that they get title insurance. I just can't believe how many mistakes title companies make, and I see it all the time. So it really does cover them, and it covers them in particular when they get ready to sell the house down the road, because that's when the problem they'll figure out the problem. It'll be when they want to sell it and then they can't sell the property.
Right. And I believe that and correct me if I'm wrong, it might just be per title company. I believe that if my sellers have title insurance, the new buyers get a discount on their title insurance. If I've had that happen. I don't know if it's property specific or title company specific. And it's probably a nominal discount. I will say you do get a discount when you purchase both owner's title and lender's title. Since the lender's title is required, if your client elects to purchase owner's title, they do get a discount. Weirdly enough, the discount comes off of the lender's title insurance cost. Don't ask me the rhyme or reason. Even our title processors don't really know why, but it basically reduces the cost of both policies when you get both together. So if your buyers really need you to sell it to them, they get a discount. Just get it, call it a day. So here on the contract, it does give them the right to select it. At this point, it gives the right for them to ask the seller to pay either $300 toward the purchase. Not quite sure why it's this random arbitrary $300 fixed amount. Or they can ask the seller to pay the entire cost. It's really uncommon for these two options, especially C. I most often educate my buyer, buy it for yourself, pay for it for yourself. If we get, seller paid concessions, it'll all come out in the wash anyway. I haven't had a case where $300 made sense either. So, but that's up to you. That's a negotiation piece. But I would trim the fat and have them pay for their own buyer's title. So, and then seller's agreement to pay any amount toward the purchase of owner's title policy insurance shall only apply to buyer's election to purchase this policy at the time of closing. So they can't say, oh, well, if I did buy it, it would have cost me $1,600. I'm not going to buy it, so go ahead and give me a $1,600 credit. It doesn't quite work that way. That's what that sentence basically tells us. So proration. is a super fun topic that will really bore you to death if you let it. So in Ohio, property taxes are paid in arrears. So this section has a lot to do with how that proration is calculated. So tax bills in Ohio are billed a full year in arrears. Look at that. I didn't even realize that it said that as the first sentence. So the buyer shall be responsible for any and all property tax bills that come due and payable in the next semi-annual period that begins the date after closing, including bills that relate to a period of ownership prior to the buyer's purchase. So this is where we kind of sometimes have to, again, educate our buyers on how property taxes work. The buyer has property taxes that begin accruing from the date of ownership. So they close on Jan 1, buyer's property taxes Jan 1. However, that seller has accrued property taxes through Jan 1 that have not even been billed by the county at that point. So how we solve that is at closing, the seller gives a direct credit to the buyer, which again comes out in the wash, for accrued property taxes based on the current tax amount for that property up through the date of closing. That's all we can do. If property taxes adjust, the seller is not liable for those, and that's mentioned in here also. There's no guarantee that that property tax will or will not adjust. However, the decision was made, we go off of the information we have. If it changes down the road, that's all on the buyer, and that's all anybody can do. So all real estate taxes and assessments, including but not limited to penalties and interest, which become due and payable prior to in the semi-annual period in which the closing occurs. And also this applies to if the seller owes property taxes or there are issues with that or liens of some kind, those are all going to be paid off by seller proceeds at closing. So since property taxes attached to the property, your buyers do have some risk here if those property taxes are not handled properly before closing, and then also if they weren't credited properly for those funds after closing. So make sure you're really aware property taxes attached to the structure. A pro rata share calculated as of the closing date in the manner set forth below. We'll get into that. And then the amount of any agricultural tax savings accrued as of the closing date, not as common. Check the buyer will use real estate for agricultural purposes. If you deal with a lot of those types of properties, I would make sure that you're very, very well versed in how that works. I would enlist the help of your title company to make sure that all of that is being calculated properly. I do not do a lot of agricultural work, so I don't want to get too deep into that. I would just lean heavily on title. Tax prorations. Unless otherwise stated herein, all tax prorations shall be final at closing. All prorations of the taxes shall be based upon the most recent available tax rates. That's where we say if the taxes go up, that's all we can do. We don't have any power to go back to the seller and say, hey, you owe me $400 more. Property taxes went up. Sorry, that's life. It is the intent of the seller and buyer that each shall pay the real estate expenses as follows. Short versus long proration is a very simple box, but it can make a big difference. And it really depends on the area that you practice in, because Hamilton County, Butler County, Warren County, we always, in my experience, do long proration. That's the easy answer. That's what everybody does. You go a little further north, Montgomery County, different areas in pockets in certain counties, short proration is the norm. So it's really important, again, to understand where you're practicing, what that property standards are, so that you can, again, educate your buyer. Because if you're buying in Montgomery County, you practice out of Butler, you may miss this and you may possibly be costing your buyer some money. So long proration, basically the seller pays entire taxes due, which cover the tax periods up to the date of closing. So with long proration, property tax credit is from the date of the last paid tax bill. So whatever they've paid through that seller, all accrued property taxes from the last paid date through the date of closing. So it could be almost up to a year, depending on the time of year that the closing happens, right? Long proration is that. It's all property taxes accrued by that seller. So basically they've paid for every day they've lived in that property as far as property taxes by the time they credit at closing. Short proration is only, it's as of the date of closing based upon the amount of the annual taxes to establish a daily rate of taxes, and then multiplying the daily rate by the number of days from the first day of the current semi-annual tax period to the date of closing. So that could potentially cut out the credit for property taxes for months for your buyers. So short proration is actually more beneficial for our seller, whereas long proration is beneficial for your buyer because it gets them the full credit. And keep in mind, this is a single checkbox on this contract, very easily missed if you're the listing agent reviewing this, very easily checked and not understood. So make sure you can explain that to your buyer. The best method for buyers would be long, because then they get compensated for all tax bills that are coming their way based on current info. But it's not standard everywhere. Chris, do you have anything to add about the exciting topic of tax proration?
Well, you have a much more detailed explanation of that than I do. I'm not a real tax guy, so here's the way John Jonas, attorney John Jonas, explained it to me. If it's in Montgomery County, check that box. If it's not, don't check the box.
That's the Cliff Notes version of my 10-minute tirade.
Yeah, that's what I do. So if you're in Montgomery County, which is, we do have agents in Montgomery, so a lot of them are already kind of used to this. So
yeah, I learned the hard way with that. I had a property there, and we ended up agreeing to short proration, and I thought I understood it, and I didn't. So it's a really important piece to understand. And again, it's very territory specific, but at any time, there's no restriction against short proration in Hamilton County, in Butler County, in Warren County. So just be mindful. It is what it is if that box gets checked, and title will catch that, and they're the ones who will calculate that proration.
You had a terrific explanation of that, so that was great.
Yeah. So any special assessments as well. These are basically just if there's a you've got standard property taxes, but then a city or some areas may include a special assessment for storm sewers, for streetlights, for landscaping, for public areas. It really can be anything at any time. If you note on the MLS, it does ask in that section about semi-annual taxes and also assessments. If there are any assessments, obviously you should, as a listing agent, do your due diligence and look that up and put it on there. But I actually steer more toward of record, because if something happens during the listing process, or if I miss something, I want to make sure that agent is looking at the most current information that comes around. So this would be that section for any assessment pieces that would be due and payable, would also be put on the settlement statement and made sure that everyone is made whole in the way that they needed to be made. Which is separate and apart from property taxes. So just make sure you remember that, but it's all kind of under the same lump of umbrella. If you do new construction, I'll be really honest, this won't be the contract that the builder will use. So this would be a very specific contract if you're dealing with maybe with a custom builder or something outside of the norm. But every experience I've had with a builder around this area, Dries, Fisher, MI, Ryan, Todd, all of the bigger builders, even down to your Artisan and your John Henrys, have their own very specific contract to purchase. So while it covers new construction in this particular contract, I would never expect that if your buyers are building new, this would be the contract that anyone operates out of. So be mindful. It does have a section in here discussing new construction and how that property tax can obviously vary, because the property taxes and assessed value of vacant land will change substantially once that property has a structure. And that's basically just what that is discussing there. So, but again, your builder is going to have a special contract to purchase. It is probably longer than 11 pages. So have fun with that. Other prorations, this section just kind of covers everything else that possibly could be due and payable at closing. The biggest ones that we usually see are these homeowner association assessments and other charges imposed by the association under the terms of the documents. Some newer HOAs actually have, in addition to this, a contribution to a capital fund, where not only do you have your annual HOA fees, but in order to get that HOA budget up where it needs to be to add some beef to it, every new home that's sold has a $500 deposit or $1,000 required deposit into this fund that's separate and apart. And they're basically just doing that to get that budget number up there. So make sure that your buyer knows that could be possible. You standardly only see that with newer HOAs, but I have seen it with existing HOAs who possibly have had some struggles with budget lately. So that's determined by the HOA. You have no control over that as an agent or even as a homeowner, unfortunately. So, and then also rent and operating expenses if the real estate is rented to tenants. This is important if you're buying a property that's currently a rental. The security and or damage deposits held by seller shall be transferred to the buyer at closing without proration. So be really mindful if you're purchasing a property that has a current tenant who intends to stay, that seller received the security deposit from that buyer, from that tenant at the beginning of their lease usually. So you need to make sure that that comes to you, because once that tenant terminates their lease or it's ending, you're not only responsible for returning that to them based on good performance, but also possibly retaining portions of it if there's damage to the property. So that's a piece that some people often miss with a rental. The next section is, we're getting there, guys. The conveyance and closing. So this is kind of a big paragraph. Closing services will be provided by title company designated by the buyer. In the state of Ohio, the buyer chooses title companies. But if you did a Family Feud poll of 100 strangers and asked them what their preferred title company is, I would be hard pressed to guess that even one outside of a real estate agent would know what a title company is or have a preference. So your buyers lean heavily on you here to recommend a good title company who's going to take care of them and also get things done when they need to be done. So that being said, if they have a title company they insist upon using, it's their choice, but it helps to have a couple of really good companies in your pocket to recommend so that you can make sure they're taken care of. Cost is very similar across the board. Performance is not. So just make sure you're taking care of your clients and list whoever that title company is right here in this blank. Some people do TBD, to be determined. I think that's odd, especially since I normally insist upon earnest money going to title. We've already had that discussion and my buyers have already selected. So it's important to note the title company and or its attorneys do not represent either buyer or seller. So whereas the title company will have a real estate attorney, if you're getting into specific questions as far as that could go into a gray as far as representation, make sure you're aware that title company has to be a third party. They cannot show bias toward either side. So, and they'll very clearly put you back over in that corner if you start to cross that line. This section also discusses if buyer or seller desires legal representation, they shall hire their own attorney, separate and apart. They can't even hire the real estate attorney at the title company because of the affiliation with the title company. So make sure they're clear there. Buyer and seller agree to execute all documents required by the closing agent. Seller is responsible for transfer taxes and conveyance fees. condo association fees, and all of the other little pieces, the status letter that goes into that, that's all on the seller. The buyer is responsible for their own title insurance, the lender's title insurance, the title processing fees. Those are all separated on that settlement statement. They're pretty standard kind of across the board as far as who pays what where. But you may see some variability, and all of that's negotiable. So if there's a different negotiation that happens in the course of the deal, make sure that title is aware of that so that they can reflect it properly on the settlement statement that they're going to provide in anticipation of closing. Title shall be free, clear, and unencumbered as of closing. That's what title does. They make sure that we have a nice free, clear title to pass along, with the exception of following: covenants, conditions, restrictions, and easements, legal highways, mortgage expressly assumed by buyer and agreed to by seller's current lender in writing, all installments of taxes and assessments, zoning and other laws, HOA fees, due and payable at closing, the following assessments. This is not something I've ever entered anything into this box. Not to say that you couldn't, but I have not encountered a situation where I need to add additional items in that box. And then seller shall have the right at closing to pay out of the purchase price any and all encumbrances or liens. This is where their mortgage payoff comes in. This is where any tax liens come in. This is where those types of items come out of those proceeds for the seller at closing. Again, that's all calculated by title. So I'll say this now and make sure that you kind of write this somewhere. Any changes to contract terms, you really need to make sure title gets that information, and also the lender. For example, a short appraisal comes in, we have to renegotiate sale price. So we've gone from 380 to 370. There's going to be an addendum for that. We need to make sure title has that addendum, and also your lender has that addendum. Same thing for perhaps cash in lieu of repairs. Now we're at 380 sale price, but seller agrees to pay $5,000 toward buyer closing costs in lieu of all repairs. That is an addendum you must provide not only to title, but also to the lender. So there are a few things that you need to make sure you're in constant communication with your lender and title on, not only to make sure it's reflected properly on the settlement statement, kind of a big miss if we don't have the seller credit to the buyer, but also that could affect your loan underwriting. The lender needs to be aware of those items. If you sneak those in at the very end, you could be causing a delay in processing because that must go through certain channels at the lender. So make sure as you execute perhaps a post-inspection addendum with seller pay closing costs, or a negotiated appraisal, or a sale price that was negotiated based on appraisal, provide that to title and to your lender as soon as possible to make sure you can keep on pace for closing. That's your obligation to your client, to make sure that you're providing that in a timely fashion, and also following up to make sure they got it and that it's reflected on the settlement statement, because some things get missed. More often than not, they're not missed, but so then this is where you also list the date of closing shall be whatever date you want to close is mutually agreed by parties. So I normally refer to closing dates as like pregnancy due dates. It can move up, it can move back. Everybody's aware. We're all going to be flexible and friendly. We're going to sign addendums if we have to. We're all on the same team running toward the same finish line. So short of market delays or market negligence by one party or another, most of the time people are pretty flexible with those and can make the deal stick together even if there's a delay. Notwithstanding anything to contrary in the event buyer and seller proceeding in good faith and closing cannot occur due to occurrence, the date of closing shall be extended for a period of up to 7 calendar days. So even the contract allows for some flexibility there. And that's right off the cuff. This is right as part of this purchase contract. We're saying there can be some flexibility there. Unless otherwise agreed, extension shall extend the terms of possession and occupancy by an equal number of days. So everybody knows closings can fluctuate. Lender processes, appraisal, receipt, all of those things can happen. Just make sure everybody's aware. It's not a hard and fast date. The next section, make the deed to. This is who is going to be listed, well, that's a good box, as the owner of record. So it typically is your buyer, but note it could be their trust. It could be, you could add people to it that aren't on the loan or things like that. So make sure you're asking your clients who specifically they want to have the deed made out to. Don't assume that they want it a specific way. Ask them the question. It can be adjusted after the fact, obviously, but it's important to make sure that you understand how they want this property to reflect owned in the public record. So if they are looking at like a transfer on death and things like that, you may want to recommend that they enlist the help of a real estate or estate planning attorney, especially if it's a complicated piece where we're going to put it into this trust or some other type of process. You may need to enlist their estate planning attorney to make sure you're putting the proper information for the deed. Separate and apart, but all part of good service and making sure that they're taken care of. Chris, do you have anything to add about that? I know some people kind of standardly list it as like a joint tenants with right of survivorship. I don't standardly, but what are...
I keep it simple, just like what
Yeah.
you're just saying there. Yeah, I don't put too much on there.
Yeah, it's really up to them.
Yeah.
I like to try to stay out of, not only real estate law, but estate planning law if I can, and not make recommendations on that kind of item. Plus, be mindful, if your client wants to deed the property to an LLC, the mortgage company may prohibit that type of deed. So that's another piece to know. They say, oh, I want to make an LLC for limited liability. I'd like to deed the property to that. The mortgage company may have an issue with it appearing to be an investment property. So again, you look really smart if you can catch them and say, well, maybe do a trust. Here's a great real estate or an estate planning attorney if you want to deed it to a trust, but your mortgage company may not love an LLC. So just little bits and pieces to know. Possession and occupancy, subject to the rights of tenants, possession and occupancy shall be given either at closing or on or before. As a buyer's agent, I prefer at closing. As a listing agent, I like a little bit of time for my sellers to get out after we've secured the close. That's all negotiable, but no, this is not a lease back. That's a separate animal. This is a few days, maybe a week for the seller to vacate. So seller shall have the right of possession free of rent, unless otherwise specified. Shall pay for utilities used. This goes into them calling the utility companies, making sure we have final read. Basically, the seller acknowledges that the buyer taking possession of the real estate, the seller really needs to remove all personal possessions not included in this contract and all debris. You'd be amazed how much trouble that one little sentence causes. I educate my clients that not everyone cleans the way you clean. My version of clean may be very different than your version of clean. The standard is usually a broom swept standard, which doesn't necessarily mean they've crawled around on hands and knees and scrubbed the baseboards, but it's a reasonable amount of clean. I would just ask that you educate your buyers and your sellers on just being good people. But again, not everybody cleans the same way. So for my buyers, I always recommend a professional clean and sanitization before they move in. Sometimes I gift that to them. And then for sellers, the same. Maybe have the place cleaned after you move out, just so we're providing a nice product for our buyers. But just something to note. But if your seller has a bunch of stuff left in the property that was not requested by the buyer, note that they will likely have a problem with that, and may ask the seller to pay for Junk King to come in and remove those items. And that also includes leaving a bunch of stuff at the curb for trash. Some sellers say, oh, well, we took it to the curb. Well, that's great. It's Monday and trash day is until Thursday. So now this could create problems for your buyers. Just at the final walkthrough, make sure that the property is in good condition for your buyers to move into. Agency disclosures, we all know what those are. Get the disclosure signed as part of the contract at the beginning, make your life easy. Company specific provisions, I don't really use this box for much. MLS and public record acknowledgement, they acknowledge that the realtor shall disclose the sales information to any MLS that we're a member of. And they also authorize us to disclose the financing settlement charges paid by seller and other concession data upon inquiry. When we put this into the MLS, we normally put seller paid closing costs, we put the type of financing, that's all just for record keeping. The next section, I'll just kind of run through real quick. Sole contract, the parties agree that this contract constitutes our entire agreement and no oral or implied agreement exists. Really important that that's something you adhere to. You don't really want to do a whole lot out of the realm of this contract without the assistance of a real estate attorney, with the exception of personal property addendums that are perhaps negotiated separately. Those wouldn't necessarily be provided to title or to the lender, but just make sure that you're doing all of that above board. General items interpreted and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Ohio. And all seller certifications, representations, and warranties contained herein shall survive the actual date of closing for a period of 1 year. I don't know that there's a whole lot of teeth to that. I haven't had to go up against that in any way, but just note that that's a section of their seller non-foreign status. This kind of gets into citizenship. And the seller is a foreign person. Seller acknowledges and agrees that at the time of closing, buyer may require tax withholding from seller's proceeds up to the maximum not permitted by law. So if you're dealing with some of those more complicated deals, this is a CPA question, this is a title question, this isn't an agent has to sort this out question. Electronic signatures, everybody agrees to using electronic signatures, usually up until closing. Indemnity, buyer and seller, this is part of the listing contract too. Everybody acknowledges that we are relying on all information provided or supplied by seller or seller sources and buyer sources. We are only as good as the information we can obtain. And we do our best to not misrepresent or misuse that information and relaying it to the public. Electronic wire fraud. This is huge. We have them sign the anti-fraud disclosure. Basically, I call that my don't send money to strangers form. And then I reiterate that it is really important not to provide that information. Even if it looks like an email comes from me or someone in my office, always verify with me because hackers are really good. And once you wire funds, they're gone. The chances of getting those back are so slim. So make sure they're aware. A lot of title companies will not email wire instructions for closing funds. They will make the buyer themselves call. They will provide the information verbally over the phone. They will not email those at the risk of it being intercepted and something manipulated. And then that buyer has lost funds. The acknowledgement, contract acceptance date. This is the date that everything starts off of, right? So contract performance dates and contingencies in the contract shall commence on the day following the contract acceptance date. So we get it all locked and loaded today. The day that starts all these timelines, day one is tomorrow. So today's the 27th, 28th is day one. So it's not hard math, but you might be surprised at who can't do that math. When you submit the offer, an expiration is great, depending on the deal. You know, if it's a multiple offer and they're leaving it open till 5 p.m. on Sunday, don't be the guy that says, but we want an answer by noon on Saturday. Probably going to be told to take a hike because we've got other offers. So sometimes that's part of a conversation with the seller's agent. If it's not multiples, call and ask, hey, are the sellers local? Is 12 hours reasonable? Is 5 hours reasonable? It's understandable that you want a response quickly, but don't make it impossible for that agent to do their job or for the sellers to make a good decision. They may end up letting it expire and then you've lost it for your buyer. So, you know, I often find a short expiration time is not a smart thing to do. I don't like to start deals that way. I like to be reasonable, and most sellers will say we're not making a decision in 2 hours. It's just not realistic. So I don't know, especially in this market, they don't have to.
Yeah.
Buyer certification. Buyer certifies and warrants that the signatories below have full authority to enter into this agreement, and that any and all additional signatories, spouse or otherwise, who are necessary in order to purchase the property, obtain lender financing, have expressly agreed to sign such required purchase. This gets into your dower rights. The state of Ohio, we have spousal rights, dower rights, ownership rights to the property. Not every state has those. Very few states actually still have them. Again, make sure your buyers are aware if they're married to each other, because they will be asked, that there are certain rights that that spouse has with regard to property ownership and also property transfer. So if they're separated at the time of closing, sometimes it can be awkward, but they're legally married and everybody has to play nice together just to get the property sold. Those are fun. Action certification by seller, same difference here. The seller has the option to accept, reject, or counter offer. And then they also have the ability to list an expiration on their counter. Everybody signs. Contract acceptance date once it's locked and loaded. Receipt of earnest money as the buyer's agent is your job to manage that timeline and to receipt the earnest money on this contract only after you verify it has been submitted. We all love our clients. We want to do the right thing. Yeah, Marcy, I submitted that earnest money. Cool. I appreciate you. Hey, title company, did you get the earnest money? If the answer is no, do not send this receipt to that listing agent. You're basically providing your word stating that it's been submitted. So if that earnest money never shows up, we got a problem. So make sure you're doing the right thing by your professional standards too. Make sure you've got, some listing agents want to see the receipt, others just take you on your word. So make sure that your word is worth taking. Make sure your sellers and your buyers sign this second page. This is what authorizes the MLS, title, lender, and administrative processors to access this contract, since it's a confidential, legally binding contract. And then this is all the information for the buying agent and the listing agent. Complete that. If you're submitting an offer, take 45 seconds of your life and complete not only your information, complete the other agent's information, because for me in particular, how you do one thing is how you do everything. So if you half-ass this contract, that's how you're going to manage this deal if I'm a listing agent. So you're showing me how you perform, how you work, and the importance of doing things the right way when you submit this. All of this information is readily accessible in the MLS. It does not take a lot of time to complete, but it really can give your buyer's contract a leg up just by giving a really good professional impression to the listing agent. You might be surprised how far that can take you. I think that's everything. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Not really. Would you be able to do just a quick run through of everything you just said?
Yeah, just run it down real quick.
I'm just kidding.
I'll need a lozenge.
You know, just one last thing. You were talking about marriage and dower laws and stuff like that. One thing, a husband can, or a wife can buy a property without the other signature. That you can do that. But once the property is purchased, then both of them are automatically owners anyway. So the problem comes when they get ready to sell it. And I've seen people, especially like in a divorce situation, where a husband or wife refuses to sign the purchase contract, the seller, when they're selling the property, that the divorcing couple who's selling the property, one of them refuses to sign the contract. And theoretically, and I've heard people give advice saying, well, they don't have to sign the contract as long as they sign the closing papers. And you'll get into a big mess. So if you have, when you submit this to the sellers, make sure husband and wife both are on the same page and they both sign. So
yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I may have misspoke there, so I appreciate the clarification. The real trouble comes when you go to sell that property if you don't have anybody on board.
But even like what you're saying, even when you're purchasing, you want to try to get both signatures, because you don't want someone to, if there's a disconnect there somewhere, it can really cause problems at the closing. So,
Right.
so do you think anyone noticed our little background change during the our
Our technical difficulty swap?
Yes. Yeah. So if anyone has stuck with us this long and you've seen the entire video and you notice the background change and lighting changes, make a comment underneath and you win an all expense paid trip to Trenton, Ohio.
Ooh,
So,
I hear it's nice this time of year.
yes, very nice. So anyway, anything else, Marcy, or you think, is that a wrap?
I think that's a wrap. I think we'll have some developing questions as this contract gets a little bit more traction and real world use and abuse. We'll just manage those as they come. So feel free. Obviously, this was such a superficial kind of high view of this contract. There are going to be specific situations and questions. Definitely reach out to myself. Chris is a lot smarter than I am. Just make sure that you're doing right by your clients. If you have questions, get clarification and don't make assumptions. So it'll be a fun ride with this new one.
Awesome. Great job, Marcy. If those of you watching, if you have questions, you can put those in the comments underneath, or you can text either of us and we'd be happy to help you. So, all right. Great. Have a great week with Mixed Money.